Millie's route home was actually covered by CCTV, apart from a very small stretch of about 20 yards. So again, you can track the movements right up until this little tiny part. So this is actually where she disappeared. Just a quick disclaimer, the content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, crime scenes and other disturbing material. Listener discretion is advised. This episode is sponsored by Think Forensic.
Think Forensic are a one-stop shop for all things forensic science and crime solving. They hold experience days, as well as corporate events, team building events and general education for primary school right the way up to university level, as well as other events and consultancy. There's also a shop where you can get your hands on all things crime solving, from evidence gathering to packaging and collecting evidence, as well as other forensic science equipment.
For more information or to book on an experience day, please visit the website.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Grave Secrets. Today is episode 5.
The flying.
And we are your hosts. I'm Beth.
I'm Annie, and today we've got a case study for you again, and we're going to be talking today about Levi Bellfield. And this is probably a name that you will have already heard of, but we are going to delve a bit deeper into his crimes. And he developed a taste for murder and preyed on young women in the south of England. So I feel like it's really important to cover all of his victims on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. So the timeline we're going to try and keep as clear as possible. We're going to be kind of working through the timeline as the investigation unfolded. So we'll try and keep it as clear as possible.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can keep up with
and do it justice as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So this case unfolded quite quickly, really.
Yeah.
But effectively, the investigation that led to Levi Bellfield being kind of, identified as a suspect in the first place was actually due to the case that we'll talk about first. So on the 20th of August, 2004, there was a call that came in to a on-call superintendent, and that at the time was Colin Sutton. Now, Colin Sutton, we've actually briefly met already, didn't we?
Yeah.
At CrimeCon in Glasgow, and he is going to be returning to CrimeCon
in Manchester.
Yes.
Exciting.
So we'll be able to have another chat to him, hopefully. But Colin Sutton, who then went on to be Detective Chief Inspector and Senior Investigating Officer, gets a call. He's at home at the time, and he's told that at that stage they've got a victim in the middle of Twickenham Green.
Yeah.
And it appears to be a stranger attack, but a woman has been murdered, and they initially thought that she'd been battered to the head, which was cause of death.
As well, it was quite an open area. If you look at any of the footage from the area, Twickenham Green is a big open space with like a few trees around it.
This is down in London.
Yeah, and it's very. I was surprised at how open it was and how many people could have been around at that time.
Yeah, it is shocking because again, so Colin Sutton got called to the crime first thing in the morning. So he got a call about 7:00. By 9:00, he was then at the police station. But the offence, it became quite clear quite quickly, had actually taken place the night before.
Yeah.
So again, it's quite a vast area. It's also in like a bit of a triangle shape, a big triangle shape, isn't it? But it links to 3 separate roads all the way along. So again, you're going to have a lot of vehicles going along the area. It was popular for dog walkers, as in most cases. And it was actually a local resident that had come across the body.
Yeah.
I think it was about 10:15 at night, wasn't it?
Which is not particularly late, and when I looked at the photos and at some video footage of the area, it was quite well lit as well. You could see across the green, and you could see the other side of it lit up with the street lights.
And we're talking August time, so it'd be like quite a nice summer's night. And apparently this local resident had decided to just go for a quick, walk around the park in the evening, and noticed what they thought was like white bags. So went over, like most people would, to have a closer look, and then realised that it was a victim. They actually called paramedics out because the victim at that stage was still breathing.
Wow.
So paramedics arrived on scene, didn't think that the victim had been there for too long at all. So obviously tried to save the victim's life, but unfortunately, she did die.
Yeah, so the victim for this was Amélie de Lagrange, and you might have heard her name because as soon as we started researching, I remembered a lot of like the news articles on this and how it was all over social media, because she was just 22 years old, and she actually came from a small village in France, and she was a student. She'd come over to study. She was living in quite a nice area. She'd just been out on a night out with friends. She'd been to the pub, and because it was a nice night, like we've just mentioned, decided, I'm going to leave. I'll get on the bus. And I think she'd got on, had she got on the bus to Twickenham?
Yeah, so she'd gone from work into Twickenham to then meet friends. And I think it was a wine bar called Crystals that she'd gone to. And then she'd got the bus back home specifically to Twickenham Green, where she literally lived two roads away from the green. I was going to say, she didn't live far
at all. And this is a walk that she would have done very often as well.
Yeah, and what's awful about it is that for whatever reason, she actually missed her stop. So rather than getting off the bus right outside Twickenham Green, she actually missed that stop, and the next stop was the bus terminal. So she went all the way to the bus terminal, asked the bus driver at that point how long it'd be until the next bus came. He said about 10 minutes. And again, quite a nice evening. It would have been warm. She thought, right, it's only about a mile. I'll just
walk back. Yeah. I think she thought it was going to take the same amount of time to walk it as it would for her to wait for the bus. So, she might as well walk if it was a nice night.
Yeah. And I thought that the way that Amelie's body was identified was really interesting in this case. It reminded me a little bit of the John Sabine case.
Yes.
When they looked at the labels in the pyjamas. So in this case, she was clothed, she was wearing white. She'd got a carrier bag with her, but she'd got no handbag or mobile phone, so they couldn't identify her initially. But in this carrier bag there was a receipt, and on one of the receipts it had 3 handwritten phone numbers next to 3 names. So they obviously had a look at the mobile numbers that were connected to the names, and 2 of them were her friends, but one of them was her boyfriend's number, who was called Olivier, I believe. And so they got in touch with Olivier. He said, my girlfriend is Amélie, and then confirmed where she lived, and that she was working as a waitress in Richmond at a patisserie.
Yeah.
And that matched with what they then came to discover about her kind of timeline of events. So that whole day for Colin Sutton, as a detective that first hears about the case at 7 o'clock in the morning, then worked till 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Because obviously, again, we've talked about the golden hour before, which is not an hour, but that's the first phase in which they try and gather as much evidence as possible. Obviously, they're getting quite a lot quite early on there. You've got an idea of your victim.
Yep.
You're getting a rough idea of what might have happened and the events that led to it, because obviously they could track with work that she'd been there with
then
friends.
with friends, yeah, and then probably with the bus CCTV.
Yes.
And I'm guessing that area will have been covered with some CCTV
and that did then
as well.
Become really significant, didn't it? Because they could actually track her movements pretty much down to the minute, and they actually saw her walking then again from the bus terminal back home. and there was like a fish restaurant that was nearby, and they'd got her right outside the fish
That's the
restaurant
footage
as well.
that I remember seeing on the TV at the time.
Yes.
That's what really stuck in my head for me. Just seeing that and then seeing the photos of Twickenham Green as well.
Yeah, yeah. So they believe that about 10 past 10 at night is when Amelie would have been then entering the green to just, again, walk straight across the green and pretty much be straight home. Now, bear in mind that the person that came across Amelie's body came across her at 20 past 10. So that's not a lot of time at all. You've got 10-15 minutes there, and then she's, got severe head injuries, and yeah, ultimately died. They did manage to get her to hospital, but unfortunately she died in hospital.
Yeah, so it was one blow to the back of the head, wasn't it? One severe blow that actually killed her.
And Colin Sutton, again, because her parents, it's not like in most cases where you can then go around to the victims' family's home and inform them of what's happened. Again, we've talked
or
about
even get
the family
them to
liaison officers.
Get them to come, because normally in this situation, if they'd ring the family, and because she was still alive when she was taken to hospital, the family might have been able to get there just for, just to see her at least. Whereas in this case, they couldn't.
So they managed to track down where her parents lived, and Colin Sutton basically rang the local police unit that was over there and said, you need to have someone go over and inform the family, at which point they then passed him a phone number for them and said, well, you can let them know. And he said, you can't inform a family that their daughter has been murdered
over the phone. Yeah, that is a bit extreme. And I think, though, because it was such a small sort of village in France where they were from, and remember, you're dealing with police from a different country, they might not have the same protocols as us, and things might not be the same. So what we think is really bad for them to do, that might be standard.
Their norm.
Over there.
Yeah, you don't know. Ultimately, Colin Sutton actually threatened them with getting the British Embassy involved.
Wow.
And said, if you don't send someone round, I'm going to get them involved, or we're just going to turn up.
Yeah.
And I thought that was, again, when we talk about getting justice for victims, that was kind of the first thing that Colin did to show just how much he cared for the victim, all the victims in the case.
And the families. Yeah.
So as the investigation is unfolding, obviously they're gaining intelligence about other, if there's any other cases. And they find out that 3 months prior to Amelie's murder, a young woman named Kate Sheedy, who was 18 at the time, had been walking into Twickenham town centre. So again, we're in the same area. She, again, was 18, so she was celebrating the last day of lessons before A-levels were about to start.
Right.
She'd got off the bus, and then, again, she'd only got 200 yards before she was going to be home. And she noticed that there was like a white people carrier. And initially it was on the same side of the road as her. And the engine was running. They'd got the headlights off, and they weren't moving anywhere. So she, again, we've talked about women being cautious.
The instinct on this one, because she just thought something is not right about this situation. And sometimes you do just get that gut feeling. She said the manner in which, he'd pulled in, the way that the car was just parked up.
With the headlights off.
There was just something that made her think this is not right.
Yeah. So she actually crossed the road, again, to put some distance between her and this vehicle. And as she crossed the road, this vehicle lurched forwards and actually hit Kate. And then after having hit her, it's horrific, but the vehicle then actually rolled over her body and then reversed back over her again. And drove away. Miraculously, Kate survived. And survived to such an extent that she managed to crawl a bit of a distance, because obviously her phone had flown out of her hand or a bag, and managed to reach for a phone, called 999 and actually called her mum and
Wow.
told her mum what had happened.
It's the injuries that she got as well were absolutely horrific. Every single rib was broken.
I don't know whether you heard her call as well to 999.
Yeah,
It's just,
yeah.
you can just, obviously she was
in pain.
scared and in pain, but you can just hear the fear, can't you?
So she had damage to her spleen, she had spinal injuries. So she was very, very lucky to come out of this alive,
absolutely.
wasn't she?
Yeah. So Kate had miraculously and thankfully survived. Now, this wasn't head injuries. This wasn't a blow to the back of the head like, in Amelie's case. However, it's in exactly the same location. It's 3 months prior. So they've got to keep an open mind in terms of the investigation at this point. But you've kind of got to prove any links if you're going to say that these two
are
cases
linked,
are linked. Yeah.
Well, especially in these ones with them not
Related.
having the same MO.
Yes, exactly.
It could, we know that not all suspects keep the same MO, do they, or offenders?
No.
So.
But then a few other cases start to arise. So 18 months before the murder of Amelie, there was another case. This was in Hampton. Again, we'll try and put a map or something on social, or maybe we'll put it in the video.
Yeah, to pinpoint.
Just to give an idea of locations. But they were within quite a close proximity within London to each other.
So Hampton's in Middlesex.
So on Percy Road, a Marsha was 19 at the time. She'd been to the cinema with friends. They had all then gone their separate ways. She'd returned home on the bus, and she'd got home off the bus at about 12:20. Again, she then walked down the road and turned right towards home. Again, a matter of yards, really.
Yeah, she was. She was so close, wasn't she? She was probably a few yards from her parents' house when this happened.
Because again, when you look at the photograph, you can see where she was killed.
Meant to get to. And what?
Horrific. And at that point, it's believed that there was someone in a vehicle that had kind of stalked her effectively, driven around the bus to Taylor, and then chances are they had wound the window down, propositioned her maybe. She'd then obviously would have said no and tried to get home as quickly as possible. And then ultimately, 100 yards from her home, she was then murdered.
It's so scary, isn't it? Like, I was thinking about this in terms of like us just walking around at night. I would not think anything about us going out and saying, right, I'm just going to walk from the taxi to up my drive to my house. And the length that she was away from home was like the length of a driveway. It's insane, isn't it?
And I just thought as well, for her parents, because she was so close to home, they would just feel awful, because they'd feel like, they were in close enough proximity to help, but they wouldn't have ever known to help. So it's just so difficult, isn't
and
it?
Unfortunately, on this one, at this time, the police just didn't have any leads.
No.
But as we can see, there is a bunch of offences now that is sort of building up.
Yeah.
And the police start, sort of piecing things together bit by bit, don't they?
Yeah. So, again, it was actually, as they were starting to piece it together, it was actually the mother of Marsha who said to the police, when she'd seen Amelie's photo get released to the press, like, don't you think they look similar? And she actually said, there seems to be a link here. Obviously now we've got a link between girls that are either getting off buses or on their way home,
traveling home alone,
home,
and the way they look now.
And so as things are unfolding, they did then get a suspect in Marsha's case, but they hadn't found any other links to any other cases. However, a 16-year-old had been reported as being followed by a strange man, and despite this being the same suspect as in Marsha's case, again, there was no evidence to actually connect the two.
That's the thing, isn't it? It's all right, you're linking stuff together, but if there's no physical evidence, it's almost impossible for the police to...
And the suspect that was seen following this 16-year-old was like a man in his early 20s, which they didn't think... In the investigation that Colin was conducting, they didn't think that fit. So they still aren't, as much as, again, we're keeping an open mind.
Yeah.
You can't just pin them all on one person. But what was becoming, very, very clear is that there was a number of non-fatal attacks that had occurred. But unfortunately, when it is non-fatal, the scale of an investigation just isn't as big.
Yeah.
You'll probably have a sergeant, a detective and 2 sergeants on it.
Yeah.
But the scale of the investigation isn't as large. So, and it's understandable because of the amount of resource that it takes and the costs. But ultimately, you are less likely to then find links.
Yeah, and in this case, the police did look at the CCTV. So the first thing to do would be to look at if there's any CCTV in the area, but also the CCTV from the bus.
Yeah.
Because most buses have CCTV on them nowadays.
Yeah.
And they did actually see that at the time she was getting off the bus, they did see a silver Vauxhall Corsa pull in. So it was like, it was like, this could be something. But then because the CCTV is on the bus is moving away, and then you lose that image, and
it's already
that is gone. Yeah. So it's very, very hard to pick up CCTV from something moving, isn't it?
Yeah. So if I just quickly talk about the non-fatal attacks that had also been flagged up in this investigation. So there was a girl called Anne-Marie Rene who was 17, and in October of 2001, again not far from where Kate Sheedy had been run over, there was an attempted abduction.
Right.
She was walking away from a bus stop. She was dragged towards a vehicle. But thankfully she screamed and put up a fight and managed to get away. And again, it was in like an open area, so then other people managed to get to her.
And this, just saying that, when you said a bus stop, again, there's a lot that is relating to around like either bus routes or bus stops. So there
again,
is
quite a young woman.
Yeah.
So then in 2003, on the 8th of January, a girl called Jessie Wilson, who was just 17, she was found laid in the snow with a severe head injury. Now, at the time, when someone found her, they thought that she'd slipped on the ice or in the snow, and that had caused the head injury, and she actually had no recollection of what had happened.
Right.
So it went, obviously, it got recorded, but they didn't actually know what had happened. So the incident wasn't dealt with like it was a crime. But when Colin Sutton heard about it, he actually went back and got the triage records from her head injuries, and they were very similar to some of these other cases.
Yeah. So he's really good at sort of trying to link the cases as well, isn't he?
Because again, that's actual evidence.
And as a detective, it's easy to just focus on the case that you're on, isn't it? And think, right, let's solve this case.
He said throughout his investigation, because obviously it was the Amelie investigation that he was on.
Yeah.
So he said his priority was always her case, because if you're going to get a vast amount of evidence, the likelihood is you'll get the most amount of evidence from the most recent case.
Yeah.
However, obviously, if there are links, then you want to find as much evidence to bolster as possible. So then in November, again in 2003, a woman called Dawn Burrows, who was 35, was also attacked, and this was on bonfire night. She also sustained severe head injuries.
Right, a little bit older than our other victims.
Yes. Yeah. And then in December, so again just a month later, a woman called Irma, also 34, was attacked while she was standing at a bus stop about 10 o'clock at night. And again, severe head injuries, and she woke up in hospital. What's really difficult with all of these incidents is that the women thankfully survived, but didn't have any recollection, which is quite common, obviously, with a severe head injury.
Yeah.
And they were all to the back of the head, so it's likely that the attacker, they didn't even
has struck from
necessarily
behind.
see
They
their
wouldn't
attacker.
even have known that someone was behind them, probably.
No.
I bet someone, took them by surprise. And there was a lot of talk around this being, obviously, stranger attack.
Yeah.
Which doesn't happen very often, does it?
No. So then again in April the following year, 2004, Adele Harbison, who was 34, had been walking back from a restaurant and was then hit over the head. She'd smashed her face into the concrete, so she'd got injuries to her face as well. But interestingly, this offence took place in Twickenham Green.
Right.
So it was only when Marcia was murdered, which was 4 weeks after Jesse's attack, who was attacked in the snow, which was initially just seen as an accident, that, again, when it was looked at the injuries of Marcia compared to Jesse's head injuries, then there was, again, a
similarities,
potential link. So, obviously, as I've just said, they are focusing on the death of Amelie and that investigation, and they're just trying to join all the dots at this point and get as much intel as possible. I mentioned that she'd got no mobile phone or handbag or anything on her at the time, and they thought this was odd because obviously she'd been at work, she'd been out with friends.
Yeah, you'd have those things with you, wouldn't you?
Yeah, you don't go anywhere without kind of those types of things. So the thought was that potentially the offender had taken them.
Yep.
So they started trying to have a look at her mobile device and get not physically look at it because they'd not got it, but look at the records.
Because a boyfriend will have been able to obviously give her phone number and say she did have a phone, this is what phone she had, so that would have helped, wouldn't it?
And when they started looking at the mobile phone data with digital forensics, what they found is that despite Amelie's body being found just after 10:15, her phone had actually pinged on like a cell tower at 10:23 near a place called Walton Bridge, which was between 6 and 8 miles away.
Yeah, in Walton-on-Thames.
So there's no way that Amelie had her phone at that point.
Yeah.
It means that an offender has taken her phone.
And it also means that to get there that quick, that they've got to have had a car or a vehicle.
Yeah.
Because there's no way you can get that distance in that amount of time. So that does sort of narrow it down a bit to someone getting in a vehicle around Twickenham Green after the offence to be able to get there in that time.
And at that stage, they then saw that there was then no further data on the mobile, which suggested that obviously it's either there's no signal, but that's unlikely in a built-up area of London. It's been turned off, or it's been destroyed. And Walton Bridge is a bridge over the Thames. So they believed that the likelihood was that the mobile and possibly the contents of her bag had been thrown into the Thames. Now that, again, you've got, multiple crime scenes here. Yeah. Because that's going to take an awful lot of manpower and legwork.
That's going to be difficult as well with it being the Thames to find anything within there as well.
Yeah. So at this stage, they've got 7 officers analysing CCTV.
Yeah. There was something like 2,000 hours of CCTV to go through, wasn't there? Like that's so... such a long time, isn't it?
And they set up a specific room for them to filter through it all, because you've got them tracking Amelie's whereabouts on CCTV. You've also then looking for an offender on CCTV, and then they were trying to plot any routes from Twickenham Green to Walton Bridge and look at the CCTV along those routes to try and match a vehicle.
There's actually so much to do in this case. And 2,000 hours, the officers that are in charge of looking through this, you'd think every little thing you've seen, you'd think, I better make a note of that because it could be important later on.
Yeah.
Like, you wouldn't want to miss a thing, would you?
No. So again, a dive team was then sent in to the water, and they were doing a kind of a distance of the water at a time, coming back up. And on their second dive, they actually
That's
found
quite quick as well, isn't it?
significant evidence, yeah. And they actually found Amelie's Walkman, which she always had on her, and her car keys. And again, it's just heartbreaking because there was a key ring that she'd got on there of herself on a roller coaster. So they knew that was then a match, to Amelie. But you just think, God, it's just been thrown in there with complete disregard.
Yeah.
Ultimately, they never found her phone, but they'd searched the Thames for 2 to 3 days, and by that point,
You just don't know where it could be after that point, do you?
And they've kind of got the evidence that they needed from it. They know that an offender had taken it.
Yeah.
They believe it's a stranger attack, so it's unlikely that there'd be data on it to show text messages potentially. Do you know what I mean? So I think
they'd got what they needed at that point. Yeah. So after all this, there was an appeal to the public as well, and after this public appeal, there was a lady that came forward called Johanna Collins, and she went into the police station to file a report. And I found this really sort of interesting, but also chilling in general as well from what she said. So this is sort of where there is, the police get a bit of a lead on a potential suspect at this point.
Some intel.
Yeah.
She stated that her ex-partner was called Levi. He was quite a kind of popular name around the area because he was a bouncer, he was a doorman, and she basically said, I was in an abusive relationship with him. He had a severe hatred for blonde women for some reason specifically. It was a misogynist, and that she'd actually found photos that he'd got of blonde women with their faces
scratched out. I thought this was really disturbing. And she went into quite a bit of detail about how bad her relationship had been with Levi.
Yeah, she was incredibly brave to come forward with it all. Because again, if it is him and she's worried that it's him, he's just
she could be in danger as well.
It's not like he's been arrested and she's now saying, oh yeah, I can back this up. She's going in there very bravely and saying...
She was very brave. Yeah. And he was just a controlling, coercive, not very nice man who had put her through quite a lot over the course of their relationship.
Yeah.
And it was really sad to listen to her talking about it as well.
Yeah. So she gave quite a lot of information. Obviously, she'd been with him for a long period of time. And she said that he was also working at the time as an illegal wheel clamper, and that he worked from a white van, and that he had been actually known to confront vulnerable women when they were parked up and basically tell them that they needed to pay a fine or that they were going to get clamped. And he seemed to enjoy this control.
It's the power as well, isn't it?
Exert control.
And he would even do this when people were parked legally.
Yeah.
So you could just park your car on the side of the road, come out and it's clamped, and he'd say, right, 400 quid to get it off.
Yeah, it's horrific.
Like, he were targeting a lot of people.
But this white van then became significant because as they were going through the CCTV, obviously all these officers, they had seen that at around 9:40 on the night of Amelie's attack, there was a white minivan which had entered the area and looked to be cruising around these 3 roads on Twickenham Green at various points for about 45 minutes. And they'd taken note of what they could, and they'd noticed that there was a damaged wheel trim on the vehicle, and it had got a light out. Now, again, the light out is more obvious, but some of these details that they pick out on CCTV, when they're talking about it, I'm like...
Where is it? I can't see that.
I wouldn't have noticed that. Again, they do reference, obviously, they just show you the CCTV in its raw state. But I know that when I was listening to interviews with Colin Sutton, he had said that they then had the images enhanced, etc. So
Yeah,
I'm pretty
yeah.
sure they'll have more than just that to go on. But
Yeah.
sometimes I just look at CCTV and I think, how are they
More than just zooming in like we would do.
How are they getting that?
So at this point, they've now got Levi Bellfield on the radar.
Yeah.
And they've got intel on, obviously, a vehicle that was used. So when police actually go and look through Levi Bellfield's file and criminal records, they actually find that he was arrested in 2024 in a Toyota, which was also a sort of people carrier style van.
Yeah.
So, it's sort of slowly piecing and linking together, isn't it?
And another detective was called in at this point, called Dave Leach, and he was asked to assist on the case because he'd got a real good local knowledge of offenders and stuff like that at the time. And again, they were still trying to track this specific vehicle at that point because they didn't get the license plate from it. So they believed that the vehicle had come from a place called Warren Motors. And this place was run by someone who was already known to Dave Leach.
Okay.
It sounds, from what I could gather, like he might have been an informant to some degree.
Okay.
Because obviously the people that are buying these second-hand vehicles were a bit dodgy.
Yep.
So he had quite a good awareness. And so they went and spoke to the owner, and he said that a man called Aaron Smith, who was a traveller, had bought 2 white vans. One was being used by Aaron or his employees, and the other one was being driven by Levi Bellfield, which now matches what Joe has said. And this vehicle had tickets against it, and the dealership owner had also said that he'd seen it driving around recently with Levi.
Yeah.
And that the back had got 2 metal plates, like the crosshatch almost metal plates that some vans have on the back, and that they'd been welded to the back of the van. So it was quite...
It makes it more distinctive, doesn't it? Now?
And they'd also painted the glass panels white and blacked out.
Because imagine how many white vans there are to go through in the area or to see on CCTV. You'd just be looking and think, oh, white van. Like,
well, what I
so
found
many.
even more crazy is at that point, right, they've not got the license plate, but they've got a pretty good, physical description of the vehicle. So Colin, there was 25,000 of the same model of this van that they believed. So Colin's team thought, right, okay, and AMPR wasn't to the same level as it is now. So they placed officers on a bridge over the A316, and they were physically looking for the van by eye. And it's just crazy to think. And I mean, but that's how significant, obviously, that lead is. And as well as that, Colin said that after work, quite a few officers were going round again in the local area trying to look for this vehicle.
Yeah.
Because they believed that it was significant.
They also looked at prior vehicles that Levi Bellfield had owned as well. So they did a bit of a check on his vehicle history.
Yeah.
And they found that at some point he'd also owned a silver Corsa.
Yes.
Which again was seen at one of the crime scenes.
And then a third vehicle popped up, and this was a Toyota Previa.
Yep.
And those plates flagged up as matching a car that had been involved in abducting a pub landlord. And it turns out that Levi Bellfield in 2004 had been arrested for abducting a pub landlord, and the Previa was involved in that case, but ultimately no charges were brought. However, they then became a match to the vehicle that had run over Kate Sheedy.
It's all starting to link together now, because we said that Kate Sheedy was the victim that was run over, but she survived the attack. And she couldn't remember things at first.
Yeah.
But as time went on, she was able to give more details about the vehicle, wasn't
Yeah.
she? So that's how
Yeah.
they've managed to get this match as well.
So he is now a suspect at this stage. And again, he'd been stopped numerous times by police because he was getting into fights and things like that. So now they're looking for more intelligence on Bellfield, and they were looking at his registered addresses, where places he'd lived, and they actually found that in 2002, in March, he'd been living at a place called Collingwood Place. And that was quite close to Walton upon Thames. It was actually the other side of where Walton Bridge was that the phone or the bag and things had been dumped and disposed of. However, it did link to another very high-profile case. And this was the abduction of Amanda Millie Dowler, as she became known in the press.
So in 2002 on Walton-on-Thames, which is Surrey, southwest London, it's a really family-friendly location. People want to live there in that area.
Yeah,
it did look really nice, didn't it?
It's one of the most desirable places.
Yeah, and it's easy to get to like central London, so it is really popular with people commuting into London as well. So on March the 21st, 2002, Millie Dowler, who was just 13 at the time, disappeared on the way home from school. So she'd actually gone to school, she'd gone to meet her friends in a cafe, and then when she was making her way back home, she walked a friend over to the bus stop. Mm-hmm. Again, we've got the bus stop link here.
What was really awful as well is, much like in Amelie's case, she'd not got off at her usual stop and gone a stop further. This was the same case with Millie, wasn't it? She'd actually gone a stop further to go and meet her at a cafe and get some chips.
Yeah. So Millie's route home was actually covered by CCTV, apart from a very small stretch of about 20 yards. So again, you can track the movements right up until this little tiny part. So this is actually where she disappeared, and it was in the middle of the afternoon. Well, it's just after 4 p.m.
She's
on a school day.
I know, she's in a school uniform. There's as well, it's very unlikely that she'd have, gone missing, as in she'd run away or anything, because she's literally just finished meeting her friends.
Yeah.
She was happy. There was no reason to
no
believe...
issues at home or anything like that.
There was no reason to believe that, she'd left home. But then ultimately, in a built-up area, she has literally just disappeared.
Yeah. I think this is quite scary because she's 13 years old. She's literally just gone, just vanished
like that.
Within 20 yards.
Yeah.
But then if you think the police are if they look at the CCTV footage, and if someone does disappear in this exact 20 yards where there is no CCTV covering it, this shows that the offender must know the area.
An awareness, yeah.
He must have known, part of the area, must have researched CCTV where it covers, must have known a lot about this area in general.
So there were no real leads in this case, unfortunately, in the search for Millie. But ultimately, 6 months later, in September of 2002, Millie's body was found. But her body was found 25 miles from where she had originally disappeared. So it was two people that were out in quite a vast area of woodland, and they were actually mushroom picking. So again, kind of off the beaten track, maybe. And it was an area called Yateley Heath Woods in Hampshire. Unfortunately, due to the condition that Millie's body was in when it had been found, she'd not actually been buried. There was kind of an attempt to cover her partially, but at that stage, due to the elements, and it did look like she had been there for a while, potentially up to 6 months.
Yeah.
That there wasn't an awful lot of information that they could get post-mortem in terms of...
Yeah, that was just because of the decomposition process and just how advanced it was at that stage.
And obviously, unfortunately, we have talked about scavengers before, so you would have had animal interference. So they didn't know at that stage what the cause of death was, but obviously Millie had been murdered. And they did think that she'd been strangled. But again, this is difficult because... So Levi Bellfield has an awareness of the area. He was living in the area at the time. They'd also spoken to Jo, his previous partner, and she'd said that Bellfield actually knew the area really well because he used to go there with her and they'd take the horse out in that area.
Yeah.
But the MO is different. Millie's been strangled.
Yeah, I was going to say it is quite significantly different, isn't it, to our normal MO for our other victims.
So did the cases link? You don't know. At the minute, there's just a similarity.
And I don't know which is worse, the cases not linking and knowing you've got two people on the loose, or knowing that they do link and you've got basically a serial killer.
Yeah. So Colin Sutton's trying to gain as much information about the suspect, in this case Levi, as possible. And it did become clear quite quickly now. We know that he is known to police.
Yep.
We know that he is doing a lot of dodgy things work-wise.
Is a very unsavoury character in general, isn't he?
Yeah, and they then develop more intelligence. So they find out that he was a bit of a mummy's boy when he was a kid, wasn't he?
Yeah, he still slept in his mum's bed until he was 16. And even when he'd go home to visit his mum in his 30s, his mum would always say, oh, yeah, he slept in bed with me last night, in his 30s.
I mean, I get that everyone does things differently and there's no right way. But...
Yeah, but until 16 is quite old to be staying in your mum's bed.
I'd say, when you go to big school.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. So in general, he's just... he just wasn't a very nice character with his ex-girlfriends.
No.
He was very abusive in relationships. There was even neighbours that came forward of Levi Bellfield when he was living with his girlfriends, saying, how nasty he was to the neighbours in general.
And bear in mind, people are coming forward with this information. They've not put a plea out there for information about Levi Bellfield at this point.
Yeah,
people are
coming forward voluntarily,
saying,
aren't they? Just, yeah.
And it then came out that he'd also got a 16-year-old girlfriend while he'd actually got a partner, again, a long-term partner. So he'd been with Jo and they'd been together for a number of years. And then he had met a woman called Emma Mills.
She was young as well, though. She was 23.
Yeah. So Emma, again, ended up coming forward, and Jo and Emma were, again, incredible in their honesty.
Yeah.
And just giving an insight into what Bellfield was like. Emma was actually held in her own home, locked in her own home without a mobile. So, we're getting an idea of how coercive and controlling he was at this stage.
And with Jo as well, she said that he would often make her sleep on the floor with no clothes and no covers, and just do stuff to really, he wanted to
grind them down and humiliate them.
Yeah.
So he'd also been known to own a flat, or rent a flat, which was, and this is horrific, known as the raping room. And this was a flat where ultimately they would take women or young girls, and him and other offenders that were believed to have also worked for this illegal wheel clamping business would abuse women. And it's just horrific to think how regular of an occurrence this must have been.
Yeah.
He was also known to sell drugs. He'd physically assaulted partners that he'd been with in the past, but he was just controlling overall and manipulative with people that he saw as being weaker than him. So there was actually a male victim of Bellfield, in a slightly different way, but definitely coercive. It was a man called Peter Rodriguez, who was a colleague of Bellfield's, and Bellfield quickly realised that he could exploit Rodriguez. And Rodriguez's mother was really ill at the time and she was in hospital. So Bellfield actually forced Rodriguez to let them use that property, one, to store drugs, but then also to, again, abuse women. And he actually got his 16-year-old girlfriend to groom a younger 14-year-old victim.
Wow.
And they would then use this house, which obviously had no kind of ties to Bellfield, again to drug and rape these two poor girls with other people, with friends.
Already while he's got a girlfriend at home that he's also abusing.
Yeah. Rodriguez, again, incredibly bravely did actually speak up and confronted Bellfield. And at that point, he was then assaulted by Bellfield with a hammer. So again, we're talking head injuries here. Rodriguez went into surgery and died 3 times on the operating table. Ultimately recovered again, miraculously. Bellfield was arrested, but he was bailed. And this incident was actually 6 weeks prior to the murder of Amelie. So again, there's so many cases where unfortunately you just think if things had been different,
if they were locked
they've
up
got
the
to go
first
on
time,
the evidence. They've got, they can't lock someone up if they haven't got enough evidence. But just to think that they'd kind of got him there, he'd been arrested.
There's quite a few cases that we've done recently where we've thought about this, haven't we? Where they've committed offences in the run up to it, and then other offences wouldn't have happened if they were. But like you said, they can't. It's hard for the police in general, isn't it?
So they placed Bellfield under surveillance at this stage, and finally they catch a break, and that is when they see Bellfield cruising around in his vehicle, spot 2 young girls at a bus stop, get out of the car and start speaking to them. Now, obviously, if you are a police officer surveilling Bellfield and you see this happen, the urge to get involved straight away must be overwhelming, but obviously they need to kind of catch him.
They need to catch him in the act and doing something. Not that they would ever wait for anything to happen to the girls, but they need it to be evidence, because he could say, I've stopped and asked him for directions. Mm-hmm. I've asked him anything. He could easily get away with that until he's physically done anything.
But thankfully, there were 2 vehicles that were tailing Bellfield. And again, thankfully, a bus actually then turned up and the girls got on the bus.
Yeah.
So what happened was one car then stayed tailing Bellfield and the other car then peeled off. And when the girls got off the bus, the officers then spoke to the girls and asked what Bellfield was actually saying to them. And they did then state that Bellfield had asked both of their ages, and then said, "Oh, you're nice and young then. I like them young." And
but
again,
saying this, it goes back to what Jo said. She said that when she was in the car with him sometimes going round, she always knew that he'd got a bit of a thing for schoolgirls, because the things he used to say to them or about them when she was in the car, she said was disgusting. It was really, really disturbing. And she said she thought, if he's saying that when he's in the car with me, what's he saying when I'm not there? And obviously this is when this is what he's saying when she's not there.
Again, then they get another break because someone else comes forward with information about a case that is potentially linked, and that was in 2003, and that was a woman called Sonia, who was 26, and she had been attacked in Twickenham Green. Again, they looked at triage records from the hospital and found that her head injuries very much fit Bellfield's MO, and they went and questioned Sonia, and she actually described a man that fit his description.
So you've got the same description, you've got the same area, because now we're on Twickenham Green again, and you've got the same injuries,
and he'd stolen her mobile phone and obviously taken Amelie's as well. So the plan at this stage was to arrest Bellfield for the murder of Amelie, the attempted murder of Kate Sheedy, who was the victim that was run over, and then the assault and robbery of Sonia, because Sonia believed that she'd be able to pick him out in a lineup. So everything is now coming together with the investigation, and they're making really good progress, when all of a sudden the News of the World then basically threatened to release details about the surveillance of Bellfield, but that would have been prior to his arrest, so that would have really...
So that's alerting him to everything they've got, really,
which again happened in last week's case. And that never ends well. So Colin Sutton had to negotiate ultimately with a news outlet, which I nearly swore then because it's just
Yeah.
ridiculous that they have to do that.
In a case that's so serious as well.
Yeah. But ultimately agreed to let them photograph the arrest of Bellfield. And again, there wasn't just one photographer.
But there was loads, weren't there? Yeah.
So ultimately, on the 22nd of November 2004, there were 2 separate arrest teams. One went to Bellfield's address, and another one went to another location that they believed that he could have been. Ultimately, they found Bellfield. Not initially.
He'd like they thought at first when they got there that he wasn't in the house. And like, where is he? But one of them just went up, didn't they, and checked the loft.
Well, again, I think Emma had something to do with it as well, because she'd kind of tipped them off that, like, make sure you check.
Make sure you check in here. And it was like one of the lofts that wasn't converted, so it had got the like insulation and everything everywhere. And the police officer just found him totally naked. Like in a corner of the loft, and obviously then managed to get him downstairs. So
it was Dave Leach that I mentioned earlier, that had quite a good knowledge of locals, local offenders. That was Colin asked for him to lead the questioning, and he said at the time he kind of didn't understand why he'd been picked for the job, but went ahead and questioned. So Bellfield originally denied everything, obviously. But when they started bringing up charges of domestic abuse of previous partners, the solicitor that Bellfield had got in with him, who he knew, unfortunately had actually worked with one of the victims of Bellfield in the past. So then there was a conflict of interest. But again, that's really frustrating, because at that point Bellfield was talking. He was saying he wasn't involved, but he was talking. And then unfortunately, when that solicitor was replaced with a duty solicitor, they then advised him to make no comment.
So it's sort of a bit of a step backwards for the police in the questioning.
They could tell that they were making him uncomfortable. He was clearly someone that couldn't sit with what he'd done, because when they were showing him like evidence in front of him, you could tell he was getting uncomfortable. They said at one point he even turned his chair round so he wasn't looking at the evidence. So he's clearly not an offender that revels in looking at evidence of his crimes,
of what he's done.
Which again goes to show how small of a person he was, really. But ultimately, they couldn't then get anything out of him. Unfortunately, Sonia, the victim that believed she could pick him out in a police lineup, didn't actually identify him either, and that was a real big blow. Because obviously that would have been a big crucial piece of evidence. I
bet she was disappointed by that as well, though, because she's just hoping that you could go in there and help at least other people.
And she wasn't actually living in the UK at that point. I don't want to get the country wrong that she.
So she was abroad.
From, but they'd flown her back for it as well.
Right.
So, again, there's quite a lot of pressure there, isn't there?
Yeah.
So. Again, Joe had come forward, his partner Emma had come forward. She was they were both very scared of him. And they then had enough evidence to charge Bellfield with 9 charges, but were holding charges ultimately.
It's quite a lot of charges though, isn't it? 9?
Yeah, definitely. While this is going on, they're still looking at CCTV. So they've now got the white vehicle that links to Kate Sheedy, and that matches the reg plates. They've got the Toyota Previa, which again matched. And then they've got this vehicle in the CCTV footage in Amelie's inquiry, which was the white vehicle. Which they did believe then matched the vehicle in Kate Sheedy's abduction. But then they've also got the vehicle that was used for the abduction of the pub landlord.
And they've got to prove that all these vehicles have links to Levi as well at this point to make the cases link.
Yeah. Colin Sutton actually apologised to Amelie's family at this stage and basically, because he met them and said, I'm really sorry, because if we'd have caught him on these previous offences, Amelie's death could have been prevented.
Wow.
But they were really understanding, obviously, and said, you couldn't have prevented it.
Yeah, you couldn't have done it yourself, yeah.
So this third car, the Corsa that you mentioned earlier, they're then wanting to get a specific link to Bellfield. So they needed to go, or they decided to go on Crime Watch with images of these cars, asking for any witnesses. And again, someone came forward, and this was actually, I think it was one of Emma's friends or one of Joe's friends. And they said Bellfield had made really inappropriate comments to them. He'd referenced having a spy hole in the back of his van that meant that he could sit in the back of the van so it looked like the van was empty and spy on women. And he also referenced having a blood-stained shirt shortly after Millie had been abducted. So they've then got further evidence. There was then reference that someone made to damage to one of the wheels that he'd changed, and said that he'd had to change it to a steel tyre.
Yeah.
And again, this matched one of the vehicles.
And these are all bits that make the vehicle distinctive, because like we said, there's loads of, Vauxhall Corsas, there's loads of white vans, there's loads of these vehicles around, but he's done these little things to them that have not helped his case in this one. They've made him more distinctive.
Yeah. And then what was really crucial was this third man that came forward, and he said that on the night of Amelie's murder, he'd been nearly hit when he was on his bike by a white van, and they'd got CCTV because he said it was outside a fish restaurant. So they then looked at this CCTV, they see a man on his bike, they see this white this white minivan in the area, and they've got it. They believe that that's Bellfield. Prior, just, minutes or before the murder of Amelie. They then go back to Emma, who was with Bellfield, and she says on the night that Amelie was murdered, she vividly remembers that Bellfield was meant to pick her up from the supermarket, but he was late, didn't know where he was. And so she'd got a cab home. He'd then kicked off because he didn't know where she was. And ultimately, he then came in that white van to pick her children up and take them to Toys R Us. So at that point, there was then they could track him further. And that then gave them a phone timestamp, effectively, of him dropping Emma off, and then the kids at home with Emma. But whenever he committed crimes, generally speaking, he would turn his mobile off. He'd obviously got a forensic awareness. On this occasion, obviously everything's been stressful. It's likely that he has already committed offences, so he knows what he's doing. But at that point, Emma realised she'd forgotten milk or something. So she actually rang Bellfield. So at that point, they flagged his phone as being in Twickenham Green at the time of Amelie's murder.
Yeah. So if his girlfriend Emma wouldn't have rang him at that time,
no,
the phone records wouldn't show that. So it's
and again, Colin said
coincidence, isn't it?
Colin said as well that he then wanted this to be used as evidence, Emma's testimony, and the Crown prosecution said we need more than that. So they actually managed to get, even though she'd paid in cash, they got the receipt of Emma's transactions at the supermarket.
Right.
So it's just such an incredible feat of detective work. Ultimately then, Colin and his team went to the team investigating the Millie Dowler case and said that they believed that Bellfield was very likely to have been involved. Obviously, he'd got reference to the address, and it also came out that it was actually Emma Mills that had been house sitting at Emma
they'd been house sitting at someone else's house. So Emma and Levi had been house sitting someone else's house, and she said that Levi had not arrived back to the house until like 11 p.m. one night, and he'd come back with some beers and a takeaway, and he'd been out of the house for the entire day. So they go to bed after they've had the takeaway, but at 3 a.m. Levi sort of gets up, says he can't sleep, that he wants to go back to the flat, and he leaves the house where they've been flat sitting and goes back to the flat in Walton-on-Thames. So the areas now are linking more together.
Yeah.
But because they were house sitting, Emma stayed at the house and she actually returned to the flat 3 days later. And she said she felt that something was off, and in the flat all the bedding had been removed. So Levi wasn't a person to have done housework or done the laundry so that everything was clean for when she got back. So she was like, there's definitely something wrong here. So she did question him about it, and she said, what has happened here? Why have you took the bedding off? And he said, oh, the dog that I brought back with me has made a mess on the bed, and you know I've had to throw the entire bedding away. So Emma's thinking it's strange, but then she notices that her car isn't there either. So she thinks, well, where's my car gone?
Yeah.
And Levi has an excuse for this as well. So he said, I've been out with friends, I had too much to drink, and I've left the car, so we just need to go and pick it up in a taxi. So Emma's like, well, I need my car, so let's go and get it.
Yeah.
So they got a taxi to the where he said he'd left the car, and when they got there, the car was nowhere to be seen. So Emma's car just disappeared.
Very strange, isn't
Like
it?
you'd be so mad at this point, but you'd be so confused just to think, well, where is the actual car?
What do you mean?
Like, what do you mean the car is just
not where you left it?
disappeared? Yeah.
So 18 months after Amelie's death, Bellfield was charged with the following: the murder of Amelie, the attempted murder of Kate, the abduction of Anna-Marie Rene, and the attempted murder of Irma. In May 2006, he was then further charged with Marsha's murder, but again showed no emotion whatsoever.
There was nothing really. I remember him seeing something about him saying in court to the jury, I'm fighting for my life here. And you think, well, that's more than you let the victims do.
Yeah.
Do you know, it's horrible, it's horrific.
Yeah.
And he was trying to come across as sort of fairly quiet and well-spoken and just not the person that
they've
knew
got
that it
evidence
was. Yeah.
to prove otherwise.
Yeah.
So ultimately, the trial went to the Old Bailey on October 1st, 2007. Even just jury selection took 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot of victims, there's a lot of other people involved that have had awareness. So even that process took 2 weeks. But ultimately, they could see what kind of person Bellfield was when he was placed under cross-examination.
Yeah.
And the questioning was relentless. And I think that's when it began to dawn on him that, you know, they'd got him, really. So on the 25th of February 2008, finally, the day of the verdict came, and the courtroom was absolutely packed. There was press there, police, obviously the families of all the victims. And they found that the first, the first charge that came through was Marsha's, and they heard that it was a majority guilty verdict. And apparently at that point, Colin turned and said that was their weakest case evidentially.
Yeah.
So if he'd been found guilty on that case...
So then they were expecting a guilty verdict on the rest,
So he was found guilty on the next 2 counts, and Kate Sheedy then made a statement, and that was incredibly brave again to go in front of all the press.
Yeah.
She said, with this verdict, I can finally move on with my life and attempt to put this behind me. Of course, I will never be able to forget what happened to me. The scars on my body and the memories that I have are something I will never be rid of, but hopefully I can move on. Yeah. Attending court and facing my attacker was very difficult, but something I felt was important. The court process has been a long and arduous one and stirred up many unwelcome memories, and a lot of evidence has been hard to listen to. But it is finally over, and the fact that Bellfield has been found guilty means more to me than I can possibly say.
Yeah.
So incredible, really. And then ultimately, he would go on to be then found guilty of Millie Dowler's murder.
So for these, he was sentenced to life, and they advised that he should never
No.
be released.
So that was in 2011 that he was found guilty of Millie Dowler's case. He remains Britain's only serial killer to be sentenced to 2 life sentences.
2 life sentences. And he's actually in Wakefield prison.
Yes.
Which is very, very close to us right now.
Yeah. So 2 life sentences, there's no chance that he's going to be out on parole
and
or up for parole. Or...
he shouldn't be either with
it's horrific.
what he's done.
So, as always, we want to bring it back to the victims. And unfortunately, obviously, there was the murder of Amanda Millie Dowler, 1988 to 2002. Marsha McDonnell, 1983 to 2003. Amelie Delagrange, 1982 to 2004. And the surviving victims. That's Kate Sheedy, Jessie Wilson, Adele Harbison, Arma de Groschke, Rachel Cowles, and Anne-Marie Rennie. So, again, a tricky one today. An awful lot of evidence.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, an awful lot of victims.
Yeah.
But thankfully, incredible justice.
And incredible police work.
Yeah, and Colin Sutton did actually receive a commendation for his work, which, was
well
deserved.
Yeah, definitely. So that is our case study for today wrapped up. So we hope you've been able to follow that.
Yes.
Quite easily. I know we've jumped about a little bit with the dates, but with there being so many victims, we want to make sure we did them all justice and covered each one in as much detail as we could. So,
So thank you ever so much, as always, for listening. And until next time, take care.
Bye.